October 1983. Vermilion Parish, Louisiana. The smell came first, that particular rotendiron smell of standing water over clay, the kind that coats the back of your throat and stays there. Calvin Thibodaux noticed it every morning when he walked the fence line of the 47 acres his father had left him, the same way he had walked it for 40 years. His boots sank 2 inches with each step, and he had to pull them free with a sound like something tearing loose from something it had held too long. He was 63 years old. He had farmed in Vermilion Parish since he was 22, mostly crawfish and soybean on the higher ground to the east. He read soil the way other men read a newspaper, by pressing his thumb deep into it and holding it there, feeling for temperature and resistance and moisture content. On the good east acreage, the soil would give and hold and breathe. On these 47 acres to the west, his thumb sank without resistance and came back black and smelling of sulfur. His father had bought this parcel in 1951 for $240 at a tax sale. Every man at the auction had let it go unchallenged. They called it the drowned ground, and they had been calling it that since before Calvin was born. The morning of October 14, 1983, Calvin walked to the center of the worst section, the low bowl where water pooled after rain and never fully receded, and stood still for a long moment. He pressed his thumb into the earth. He held it there. Then he took out the small green notebook his father had kept, the one with the oil-stained cover and the water-warped pages, and he turned to a page he had read so many times the paper had softened at the fold. What he was going to do next would make grown men in the parish laugh at him for the better part of 2 years, and then it would make them stop laughing. The man who laughed loudest was not a bad man. That needs to be said clearly. Dr. Philip Hargrove had spent 19 years as the regional director of the LSU Ag Center Extension Office in Abbeville, and he had seen rural families make costly mistakes on the strength of their own stubbornness. He had a desk stacked with data. He had attended 3 national conferences on Gulf Coast agricultural soil remediation in the past decade. He had seen men pour money into wetland parcels and walk away with nothing. He believed, with the careful confidence of someone who has been right many times before, that he had earned the right to be listened to. In November 1983, he drove out to the Thibodaux property in his green government truck after Calvin had submitted a request through the parish office for wetland remediation consultation. He walked the perimeter with Calvin, his boots clean, his clipboard in his hand. He stopped at the low bowl and looked at the standing water, which had risen another 3 inches after 2 weeks of rain. He said, "Mr. Thibodaux, 47 acres of this classification in this parish have one productive use, and that's Crawfish Pond. Even that's marginal given the sulfur content. You're looking at a minimum $40,000 drainage investment for soil you'd still have trouble with in 5 years." Calvin said nothing. He was watching a great blue heron at the far edge of the water, standing on one leg, absolutely still. Dr. Hargrove looked at the notebook Calvin was holding and said, "Is that a farm plan?" Calvin said, "It's my father's book." Hargrove looked at it a moment longer, then made a note on his clipboard. Later, back at the parish office, he told his assistant that the old Thibodaux man on the West Road was probably going to spend his retirement doing battle with 47 acres of swamp, and end up with nothing to show for it. His assistant had heard him describe situations like this before. She wrote up the consultation report and filed it under low viability, no further action. 3 weeks after the consultation, Hargrove attended the annual Vermilion Parish Farm Bureau dinner. Calvin was there, standing near the back with his coffee. Someone asked Hargrove about the drowned ground parcel because word moved in Vermilion Parish the way it always moved, sideways and quiet. Hargrove smiled at Calvin from across the room and said, loud enough for the men nearby to hear, "Mr. Thibodaux is going to teach that swamp a lesson." A few men laughed. Calvin set down his coffee cup and left. The community did not side against Calvin out of cruelty. They sided against him out of experience. 3 previous owners of that parcel had tried drainage schemes over the decades, and all 3 had failed. The soil was too saturated. The water table was too high. Everyone knew it. That it was also true made it no easier to be Calvin Thibodaux standing at the edge of the drowned ground in the winter of 1983, with everyone's confidence pointed the other direction. His father's notebook was not a document of theory. Jacques Thibodaux had not been a man for theory. It was a document of observation, 40 years of handwritten entries about water, soil, temperature, and plant behavior across this specific 47 acres. Jacques had purchased the parcel believing it was solvable. He had worked on it periodically through the 1950s and 1960s without making progress, not because he lacked the answer, but because he lacked the machine. On page 41 of the Green Notebook, there was an entry dated June 1962 that read, "Lotus. Like Chinese grow in Delta. Water don't stop it. Water feeds it. Wrong to see the water as enemy." Jacques had written 6 more pages about this observation, starting from a conversation he had in 1959 with an elderly man named Po Sing Chen, who had been growing Nelumbo nucifera, sacred lotus, in flooded paddies outside Beaumont, Texas, for 30 years. Chen had explained that lotus root, the edible rhizome, required constant shallow standing water, rich organic soil, and full sun, conditions that were disastrous for conventional crops but mandatory for lotus cultivation. He had explained that the American market did not yet understand the crop, but that Chinese and Vietnamese restaurant owners in Houston, New Orleans, and Baton Rouge were importing it at significant cost, and that fresh domestic product would command a premium. Jacques had written at the bottom of page 46, "The water is not the problem. The water is the field." He died in 1971 without acting on it. The dragline machine he had acquired in 1965, a 1956 Bussy 10B crawler dragline, purchased at equipment auction for $600 because no other buyer saw use for it, sat in the east shed under a canvas tarp, maintained on a monthly schedule by habit, cleaned and oiled, and started even when there was no work for it to do. Calvin had read page 41 of the notebook perhaps 200 times in 12 years. He understood it in October 1983 in a way he had not understood it before, because the water that year had been exceptional. The bowl section had held water clear through August, which had never happened in his memory. And that summer, without anyone planting them and without any particular cause, a cluster of lotus plants had appeared at the northeast edge of the standing water. 3 stalks, pink flowers, the rhizomes visible in the shallow edge. Calvin looked at them for a long time. He pressed his thumb into the soil around them. He took out the green notebook and wrote in it for the first time in 12 years. The next morning he pulled the canvas off the Bussy 10B and started the engine. The machine took 20 minutes to warm up in the November cold, its diesel giving off a particular blue smoke that Calvin knew meant it was ready when the color thinned to gray. The 10B was a cable-operated crawler dragline, not hydraulic, not computer-assisted, not anything built after the Eisenhower administration. It weighed 14 tons. It moved at a pace a man walking slowly could have matched. The cable drum for the drag bucket was worn smooth at the center from decades of use, and the bucket itself, a half-yard capacity, steel construction, 1960s fabrication, had been resharpened at the cutting edge 6 times that Calvin could document. What Calvin needed to do was not drain the land. He needed to sculpt it. The original error, he understood from his father's notes, was that everyone who had attempted to improve the 47 acres had tried to remove the water. They had dug drainage ditches, installed tile systems, pumped and diverted. And every time the water table had reasserted itself within 2 growing seasons, filling whatever they had emptied. The soil was too saturated, too deep to ever be made conventionally dry. The correct approach was the opposite. Calvin needed to deepen the water in the bowl sections to a controlled 18 to 24 inches, deep enough for lotus rhizomes to develop, shallow enough for the plants to photosynthesize, while building up the surrounding berm sections with the excavated soil, so he could walk the field, access the plants, and manage the water level with one control gate at the field's low southern corner. He began in November 1983 with the first cut, working the 10B in long parallel passes across the northeast quadrant, pulling soil from the deepest sections and depositing it on the perimeter berms. He worked 6 days a week. He worked alone. By January 1984, Dale Fontenot, who ran the feed store on Route 14 and had known Calvin since they were both in grade school, drove past the property and saw the dragline operating in the cold and stopped his truck on the shoulder. He watched for 10 minutes. Calvin did not stop the machine. Fontenot drove to his feed store and told the first customer who came in that Calvin Thibodaux had apparently decided to rearrange the drowned ground with a machine that belonged in a museum. The customer said, "What's he growing?" Fontenot said, "Nothing grows in there." Calvin had ordered 30 pounds of Nelumbo nuciferae rhizomes from an agricultural supplier in California in December 1983. The order form listed them as ornamental. The price was 42 cents per pound. He had stored them in damp burlap in the root cellar through the winter, checking them every week for viability, discarding any that showed rot. In February 1984, the Bussy threw a cable. The main hoist line, which had been inspected but not replaced, separated at a weld point on a cold morning when the temperature dropped to 28 degrees overnight, and the metal contracted beyond what the old weld could hold. Calvin was at the controls when it went. The cable snapped back and took a section of the cab's protective frame with it, and the drag bucket dropped into the half-excavated northeast section and sank 18 inches into the mud. He sat in the cab for a moment. He could hear the field around him, the wind across the open water, a red-winged blackbird somewhere to the south. He climbed down and walked to the shed and returned with a come-along, 2 chains, and a length of 3/4-inch rope. He spent the rest of the day rigging a recovery. He pulled the bucket free by hand cranking the come-along against a berm anchor, took 4 hours, and then he assessed the cable situation. A replacement hoist line for a Bussy 10B was not a part that any supplier in Vermilion Parish carried in 1984. The machine would be down for 6 weeks while the part was sourced from a salvage dealer in Memphis. Calvin used the 6 weeks to hand-dig the berm sections on the southern edge with a spade, level by level, checking grade with a water level he made from a section of garden hose and 2 stakes. He also drove to the New Orleans City Library and spent 2 days in the reference section, reading every document he could find on commercial lotus cultivation in Asia, and on the small but growing market for fresh lotus root in American cities, with significant Asian immigrant populations. He found one USDA report from 1979 that mentioned a grower in California supplying Vietnamese restaurants in San Jose. He took notes on pricing. Fresh lotus root was retailing at Asian grocery markets in New Orleans at approximately $2.80 per pound. Imported. The domestic supply was essentially zero in the Gulf region. The cable arrived from Memphis in late March 1984. Calvin reinstalled it himself, working from the machine's original technical manual, which was stored in the shed in an oilskin wrap. He completed the primary excavation by May 1984. The northeast quadrant was now configured as a series of 6 connected paddies, each holding between 18 and 22 inches of standing water, separated by narrow earthen berms wide enough for Calvin to walk single file. The total cultivated water surface measured 31 acres. The remaining 16 acres of the parcel became the berm and access road structure. He planted the rhizomes in May 1984, pressing each one into the paddy bottom by hand, working from the berms with a long-handled planting tool he had fabricated from fence post and a modified bulb planter. He planted at 4-foot centers. The water was warm by then, 81 degrees at surface, and the sky above the field was open all the way to the horizon. 3 men drove past on the road that month, and all 3 slowed to look. The field looked like he had turned 47 acres of Louisiana farmland into a series of ponds and was standing in the middle of it doing something with a stick. None of them stopped. By July 1984, the first lotus leaves appeared. Not 3 stalks, as in the previous year's wild growth. Hundreds of them, the large circular pads rising on their stems and flattening over the water surface, covering the paddies in green from berm to berm. Calvin walked the berms each morning and noted the growth rate in the green notebook. He wrote measurements, water temperatures, leaf diameter, stem count per square yard. He did not mention any of it to anyone. He bought groceries in Abbeville and paid his property taxes and spoke to his neighbor Raymond Arsenault about the weather and the price of crawfish, and whether the Cajuns would have a decent season. He did not mention the lotus. In August 1984, he noticed the water in Paddy 3 running slightly low. The berm on the east side had developed a seep, a slow loss of 2 to 3 inches per week. He addressed it with a clay and grass slurry packed into the seep face and covered with a section of salvaged pond liner weighted with stones. The repair held. He wrote it in the notebook. In September 1984, he began probing the paddy bottoms with a graduated rod to check rhizome development. He found the first mature rhizome at 4 feet below the paddy surface in paddy 2, a white, segmented root structure running horizontally through the clay, firm under pressure, the size of a man's forearm. He cut a section free and brought it to the surface and looked at it in the morning light. Then he set it on the berm and continued probing. There were thousands of them. He did not call anyone. He went back to the shed and sharpened the harvesting tool he had fabricated the previous winter, a modified clam rake with extended tines, capable of reaching the rhizome depth without disturbing the plant crown. He worked through the geometry of harvest timing and decided on mid-October, when the plants would be past their peak growth cycle and the rhizomes at maximum starch content. He wrote one line in the green notebook that evening: "Ready." The first harvest took 4 days. Calvin worked alone, weighting the paddies in chest waders, pulling rhizomes by hand after breaking them loose with the rake. He worked paddy by paddy, piling the harvest on the berms in plastic crates he had bought from a seafood supply company in Lafayette. On the 4th morning, he stood at the edge of paddy 1 and looked at the crates stacked along the berm. He had harvested 2,240 pounds of fresh lotus root from the first season planting. He had spent, in total materials and labor, approximately $4,800 on the project over the 2-year preparation and first growing season, not counting the busseracery, which he had already owned. The week before harvest, he had driven to New Orleans and met with the purchasing managers of 4 Asian grocery markets, 2 Chinese, 1 Vietnamese, 1 a mixed goods store on Magazine Street, and he had brought a sample rhizome and a typed 1-page document showing expected production volume and pricing. He proposed to sell fresh domestic lotus root at $3.40 per pound, delivered weekly. The imported product they were currently purchasing cost them $2.80 per pound, but the importation logistics meant it arrived stale, sometimes damaged, sometimes shorted on weight. Fresh domestic product would hold longer, arrive intact, and could be marketed as locally grown. All 4 buyers signed purchase agreements before the end of that week. Calvin drove home and finished sharpening the harvesting tool. In the 3rd week of October 1984, he loaded his first delivery, 600 pounds across 4 wooden crates, into the bed of his 1971 Ford F-250 and drove to New Orleans. He made 4 stops. He collected $2,040. He drove home. He went into the kitchen and poured a glass of water and drank it standing at the sink. His neighbor Raymond Arsenault had stopped by and was sitting at the kitchen table. Raymond looked at him. Calvin said, "Sold out." Raymond looked at the table for a moment, then he said, "How much?" Calvin told him the number. Raymond was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Your daddy knew." Calvin washed the glass and set it in the drain rack. Word moved through Vermilion Parish the way it always moved, not in the newspaper, not in a public announcement. It moved through the feed store, through the parking lot of the Catholic Church on Sunday morning, through the cab of a truck when two men drove somewhere together. By November 1984, most of the parish had a rough version of the story, though the details were disputed. The number that people quoted was usually wrong, either too low or too high, because no one had the actual figure except Calvin, and Calvin had not told anyone except Raymond. Dr. Philip Hargrove heard the story at the Parish Farm Bureau meeting in December 1984. He heard a version where Calvin had made $60,000 on 47 acres of swamp in a single growing season. He did not believe it. He said so to the man who told him. In January 1985, Hargrove drove to the Thibodaux property. He had called ahead. Calvin was at the field when he arrived, walking the berms in the winter morning, the lotus foliage dead back to the water line for the dormant season, the paddies still and brown. Hargrove stood at the field edge for a long moment. He looked at the berm system, at the water gate Calvin had installed at the south corner, at the scope of what had been done. He looked at the berms themselves, graded, compacted, vegetated with grass to hold the structure. He said, the whole reconfiguration. You did this with the old Bucyrus. Calvin said, that's right. Hargrove walked out on the main berm to the center of the field. He stood where the standing water was now at its winter level of 14 inches. He looked across the paddies. He said, what's your rhizome yield per paddy acre at full production? Calvin told him. He also told him the water temperature range, the planting density, the harvest timing relative to leaf senescence, and the pricing structure he had negotiated with the New Orleans buyers. Hargrove listened without writing anything down. Then he said, I told you this land couldn't produce. Calvin looked at the far berm line. Hargrove said, I was wrong about that. Calvin didn't respond to that. He bent down and pressed his thumb into the berm soil and held it there, checking for moisture content, checking for anything that needed attention. In March 1985, Dr. Hargrove submitted a field report to the LSU Ag Center that documented the Thibodaux Lotus operation as a viable commercial model for wetland parcels in the Gulf Coast region previously classified as low productivity. The report was not dramatic. It was the standard Ag Center format: yield data, soil profile, water management methodology, market analysis. But it was the first document of its kind in the Gulf region to treat lotus cultivation as an agricultural commodity rather than an ornamental practice. The Ag Center began receiving inquiries from other parish extension offices within 6 months of the report's circulation. 2 landowners in Terrebonne Parish and 1 in St. Mary Parish contacted the Abbeville office asking for guidance on replicating the water management system. Hargrove returned to the Thibodaux property in September 1985 to observe the second harvest. He brought a graduate student from LSU's Agricultural College, who was writing a thesis on alternative crop viability in Louisiana wetland environments. Calvin walked them both through the paddy system, explaining water depth management, berm maintenance, and rhizome harvesting technique without ceremony. He showed them the harvesting tool, the modified clam rake with extended tines, and explained the fabrication. The graduate student asked if she could photograph it. Calvin said she could. She asked if he would consider speaking at a conference in Baton Rouge the following spring on wetland agriculture diversification. Calvin said he would think about it. He did not go. In the fall of 1985, the LSU Ag Center offered Calvin a small consulting stipend to serve as a field reference for other parish extension officers who were fielding questions about lotus cultivation. It was $300 per visit, up to 6 visits per year. Calvin accepted the first visit and declined all subsequent ones. He explained to the agent who called him that he had a field to manage, and that the report Hargrove had written contained everything another farmer needed to know. He was at the field every morning by 6:30. That did not change. Hargrove, for his part, altered one specific practice in his extension work from 1985 forward. When a farmer brought him a plan he did not recognize, he visited the property before writing the consultation report. He had done it the other way for 19 years. He did it the new way for the remaining 11 years he worked in Abbeville. He told his graduate student, when she asked what had changed his approach, that he had underestimated what a man could know about a piece of ground that he had been watching for 40 years. 14 years passed. In the spring of 1997, Calvin's granddaughter Nora was 17 years old and had been helping at the field on weekends since she was 9. She knew the paddy system well enough to walk the berms alone and identify a seep by sound before she saw it. She knew the harvest timing by the color of the leaf edge in September. The browning that started at the stem and moved outward was the signal, not the calendar date. In April 1997, Calvin took her through the east shed and showed her the Bussaraciri 10B, which now sat on a pad of crushed gravel he had poured in 1989. He started the engine the way he always started it: choke, throttle to half, engage, and let it warm for 20 minutes. It ran the same as it always had. The exhaust thinned from blue to gray on schedule. Nora watched it idle. She said, "Grandpa, why do you start it every month if it never does anything anymore?" Calvin walked around the machine slowly, checking the cable tension by hand, checking the track tension on the left crawler. He said, "Because the knowledge of how to run it is in the running of it. You stop running it, you lose the feel for it. You lose the feel, you can't teach it. And if you can't teach it and the field needs it again someday, you've lost 40 years of work." Nora looked at the machine. She said, "Has it ever needed to do more than it already did?" Calvin said, "Not yet." He showed her how to check the hoist cable along its full length, feeling for corrosion at the weld points. He showed her how to grease the drum bearing. He showed her how to read the cable drum for where the center groove worn smooth was acceptable, worn through was not. He had replaced the hoist cable once in 1991 and kept the old cable coiled in the corner as a length reference. He handed her the green notebook, the one with the oil-stained cover and the water-warped pages. He had continued his father's entries from 1983 forward, filling a third of the remaining pages with his own observations in the same compressed, precise handwriting his father had used. Nora opened it to a random page and read. She looked up. Calvin said, "When you can't figure out what the field needs, that book has seen it before." He said it the way he said most things, without looking at her, watching the engine instead, listening to the diesel note for anything that had changed from the month before. It had not changed. The 47 acres are still producing. The paddy configuration Calvin built with the Bussierasserie in 1983 and 1984 has required 3 berm repairs and 1 regrading of paddy 2, done in 2001 with the same machine. The water gate at the south corner is the 3rd iteration. The original lasted 11 years. The second lasted 9. The third was installed in 2003 and has not required replacement. The Bussierasserie 10B is still in the east shed. It is started on the first Saturday of every month. The cable was replaced again in 2008. The engine, which is a 4-cylinder Continental diesel that was already 27 years old when Jacques Thibodaux bought the machine in 1965, has not been rebuilt. It runs. On a morning in late October, when the sky above Vermilion Parish is the particular flat blue that means the heat is finally finished for the year, and the dew sits heavy on the Lotus pads, and the water between them is absolutely still. The field smells of organic matter and iron, and a faint sweetness that has no name in English, but that everyone who works the paddies eventually recognizes as the smell of the rhizomes just below the surface. Ready. Calvin Thibodaux spent 40 years listening to land that everyone else had already written off. He did not argue with anyone who told him it was worthless. He did not explain himself until someone asked. He pressed his thumb into the soil and held it there and paid attention to what the soil said back. And when his father's notebook gave him the answer, he simply began. The water was never the enemy. It was always the field. The men who could not grow anything there could not grow anything there because they kept trying to remove the one thing the crop required. The problem and the solution were the same thing, and the only difference between failure and production was knowing which crop to plant in the conditions you actually had, rather than the conditions you wished for. That is not a simple knowledge, but it is not a rare one either, if you are willing to spend 40 years acquiring it and another 2 building what it requires.